Okay, so good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first event of our conversation series, Why Architecture Belongs in the Museum, featuring today the director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, Giovanna Borassi. Welcome, Giovanna. My name is Marcela Ramos. I'm the program manager for the Art, Film and Culture program at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. Dr. Class, we call it, so you'll hear that name a lot. This conversation series is part of a multi-year initiative titled Curating Architecture Across the Americas, CAAA. It's organized by Dr. Class in collaboration with the Harvard Department of History of Art and Architecture and led by Professor Patricio El Real, who will also be our moderator tonight. Patricio is Assistant Professor of History of Art and Architecture here at Harvard and works on modern architecture and its transnational connections with a focus on the Americas. He holds a PhD in Architecture, History and Theory from Columbia University and a Master of Architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. We will put his extensive and complete biography on the chat. So our multi-year initiative, CAAA, Curating Architecture, the main goal is to bring together institutions, curators, scholars to discuss the role of architecture exhibitions and collections in curatorial practices and cultural debates. And we seek to establish a dynamic interdisciplinary and transnational network and to facilitate scholarly research in academic and museum settings. That's the idea, the goal of this long year program. So we had a first iteration of curating architecture in October 2019. We gathered architecture curators, historians, architects working in art museums and in architecture galleries from Mexico and the United States in the symposium titled Espacios de Contacto, Contact Spaces, Mexico-US. The information is on the website. And the third iteration, because now it's the second, the third one will be in 2022, next year at Harvard, Historias Ausentes, Missing Histories, to foment historical research on architecture exhibitions. That's the umbrella for the series tonight. So as I mentioned, this is the first event of 5, which comprise the series. And I just gonna briefly mention what is coming up, the 4 upcoming events. On March 17, we have Ricardo Daza from the Museo Arquitectura Leopoldo Rotter in Colombia. April 7th, Barry Bergdahl from Columbia University. On April 21st, Valentina Moimas from the Centre Pompidou in Paris. And May 5th, Patricio El Real, who will be at that time a speaker. The series run in parallel with the course Architecture in the Museum by 3 institutions, Harvard University, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, UNAM, and Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, PUC. Patricio will tell us more about the course itself, but I just want to say from Dr. Class that it's a big honor to be working and collaborating with these 2 prominent universities in the region. It's part of our mission. And I want to thank the faculty members from these 2 universities, Carolina Sepúlveda and Cristina Lopez, for their work and collaboration. So before giving the floor to Patricio, just a couple of practical information. The event will be 1 hour long. We are recording actually, and it's going to be available on our YouTube channel. You'll see on the chat we'll add our online calendar and social media channels so you can get the information there about the upcoming events. And finally, the chat is disabled, but we do have the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And please submit at any time during the talk your questions, and we'll make sure to group them and so we can ask them at the end. Just a little note about that We'd like for you to ask the questions, if you want, in person, in camera. So we'll put the people who are asking questions as panelists at the end, so they can turn on the video and cameras. So Patricio, thank you.
Thank you, Marcela. Welcome, everybody. It is an honor to have today architect, editor, and curator Giovanna Borassi, who studied architecture in the Politecnico di Milano, worked as an editor in Lotus International and Lotus Navigator, and was deputy editor-in-chief of Habitare. For all architects, we all know these very important journals. She joined the Canadian Center for Architecture in 2005, first as curator of contemporary architecture, then as chief curator. She has been director of the CCA since January 2020, taking the helm of the institution under an evolving and unprecedented global situation we're still currently managing. Her work explores alternative ways of practicing and evaluating architecture, considering the impact of contemporary environmental, political, and social issues on urbanism and the built environment. As the students in the seminar know, she speaks to architecture as a cultural object and asks a fundamental question: what is an architectural exhibition? Is it a display of architecture, about architecture, on architecture, for architecture? Today in class, we discuss precisely these questions, which Giovanna posed in a 2015 essay and continues to answer in her outstanding curatorial and intellectual work. As Marcela Ramos mentioned, this lecture series runs in parallel with the course Architecture in the Museum, which I'm currently teaching at Harvard, and runs parallel with seminars in Mexico City and Santiago de Chile. And the professors are here joining us. Last Wednesday, we had a wonderful gathering with our colleagues and classmates at UNAM, the National University of Mexico, and we're looking forward to the beginning of the semester in Chile, when our Chilean colleagues and classmates will join us in this adventure. There was some interesting coordination of Northern and Southern Hemisphere academic schedules and calendars to make this course possible, all worthwhile to build transnational alliances and research agendas. This course is part of a concerted pedagogical agenda that I'm developing in the Department of History of Art and Architecture, with seminars, workshops, and exhibitions that engage curatorial practices in architecture and study the history of architecture exhibitions. Today, amidst continued calls to decolonize and occupy the museum, architecture as a curatorial and cultural practice regains renewed urgency. It is no secret why Giovanna is here with us today. Her work and the institution she leads, the CCA, present a clear and distinct position, a strong curatorial voice that responds to pressing contemporary challenges. The impressive work of the CCA reveals a sustained praxis that enriches architecture and society as a whole. Please join me in welcoming Giovanna Borassi.
Thanks a lot, Patricio, for this welcome and this amazing introduction. And again, thanks to Marcela and this doctor class. I kind of find very interesting the acronym doctor class series that seems terrific, and also the way you are working across really the Americas. It seems to me impressive setting, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this, and I really want to thank you for inviting me. I'm scared I'm the first one, and I hope that I will be able to set a kind of good start. The CCA has this is, you see here, the CCA photographed actually from an hotel room that by Naoya Takeyama, a Japanese photographer, visited the CCA, and we really like this photo of like taken from afar, but you actually see the building that at this point is just the institutional presence of the CCA, as we are all in this kind of virtual world. So I like to use this kind of physical part of the institution still. But somehow the mandate of CCA has always been making architecture a public concern. So our constant work is actually how we interpret this mandate and how we make it the relevant for today. And I think when this was established in 30, 40 years ago, this was interpreted as a need to establish architecture as a recognized discipline, to establish architecture as an intellectual activity, or introduce history of architecture as an important component of the field. And today, maybe perhaps it's more important to underline the participation of architecture. And when I think about architecture, I think all the architecture, urban design, planning, and landscape, and so on, in a definition of a larger discussion related to problems of our societies we're dealing with. And so the issue that society is posing to us and kind of demand that architecture have its own approach to deal with this issue. And I think this is a contribution that certainly the CCA is interested in participating, and in different way, in raising doubts or creating alternative or generate ideas that maybe can be used to shape a kind of society of today or the future. So somehow what we have done at the CCA is, as Patricia was saying, we have been reflecting on larger topics and trying to situate architecture in dialogue with those topics. And we have touched, I don't know, environmental issues, question of health, relationship with technology, education, and so on. So to in this moment, so this question of the topic, so selecting actually a topic that we think is important to reflect on. And so in 2021, the main project we are working on is really trying to connect architecture and society in even a more tight way. And we are working on a show that will open in the fall that is called A Section of Now, Social Norms and Rituals as Sites of Architectural Intervention. And this is an exhibition that wants to look at how society is changing in relation to expanding notion of family or property, ownership, work, technology, and life expectation, and understand how architecture is responding to this and how architecture can also adapt to better address the challenge that this new condition are presenting. So our question is really like how spatially we are rethinking if we think that family is not anymore the same, that even how family is produced or put it together is not anymore the same, and so on. And so how all the notion of housing or public spaces or everything will need to change. And so the same is for in relation to work, in relation to question of ownership, and so on. So just to, I will not give you the full presentation of the exhibition, but just to give you a few examples of like what we are thinking about. So this is, for example, what is called a cuddling room. So more and more there are the birth of new spaces that are actually coming up because of new needs. So more and more we see that people are living alone. More and more the question of even physical proximity starts to become, at least I would say in a kind of Western society, start to become a real issue. So we start to see the new coming up of presence of an architecture that is actually a soft architecture. So with couches covered in cushion and blankets, where strangers are welcome to held or to be cuddled in a non, let's say, sexual manner, and somehow this are new speciality that are coming up. So new rituals, new function, new forms of architecture. And so this is something that we are reflecting upon. Is like all this is actually not design, and it's not like he's coming up because there is this kind of needs. At the same time, we see the reliance on digital technologies to kind of fight this physical isolation. We see it very much in what happened in the last year. But somehow, so this question of how digital might help or might actually not help, this kind of like keeping the families or groups tied together. And I think the question here is what are these new spaces where touch is possible or acceptable, and what are when we actually even are asking maybe machines to take care of these. So as baby boomers are entering in elderhood, and the healthcare system will require a larger number of workers to meet and increase the demand of care, we are more and more developing, for example, robots that will meet those needs and will then take care of these senior citizens and so on. So I would say that this is also the question of like very vulnerable moments. So I will show you this video that is actually a design object that is designed by an artist, Dan Chen, and I will continue after. I don't know.
Hello, Susie. I am the last moment robot. I am here to help you and guide you through your last moment on Earth. I am sorry that your family and friends can't be with you right now, but don't be afraid. I am here to comfort you. You are not alone. You are with me. Your family and friends love you very much. They will remember you after you are gone. Time of death 11:56. Simulation complete. Please leave the room for the next patient.
So this is actually an installation. I don't think the designer ever imagined this will be in production, but somehow this end-of-life care machine become a kind of an extreme vision of a kind of new robotic intimacy and a kind of how technology can support this like, for example, last moment of life. So the work we are doing is really trying to put together all these different questions that society is coming up with, that, and we also have seen in relation really, for example, to that, what it means now in COVID time of a lot of people actually going through this of being alone in the last moments of their life. And so somehow this question of like how what is the role of architectural design to participate to this question, and maybe raising a question, or maybe not design this kind of machine, but somehow arriving to conceptualize this moment. So this is just a snippet of this new curatorial project we are working on, but somehow it gives you a sense of how we are thinking of like what is the kind of next step of this question of like how architecture and society are connected, and what is the role of an institution like the CCA in this moment of also activate a discussion around all these questions that are the kind of fundamental question of life. And I think it wants to be also a reflection of if we can say that you know, modern architecture was very much based also on a conception of all these things of like what is a family, what is work, what is what means studying, and even the lifespan, or like how you know, the life is organized in a way that you grow up, you study, you then marry, and then you find a job, and so on. It's like how actually all this is changing and is challenged. And so somehow again, how we reimagine all this space we are inhabiting, and how architecture can be a better support for these changes. So the other question is in let's say in the overall idea of curating, is the question of, if on one side there is this idea of the topic, so always picking a kind of fundamental issue that we want to tackle, and as Patrizio said, is for architecture also to reflect upon, is also the question of the objects, which are actually the objects that we are using or we're showing, and so much, and also obviously the collection somehow, how that's connect to. So I think, sorry, I'm using two computers. This is the CCA Vaults. This is how actually the photography collection and how things are preserved at the CCA. And I think that if generally, I would say an architectural collection is associated with the preservation of important drawings, like this one of Mies, or one of Frank Lloyd Wright, or this very nice model for an Ahmedabad house done by L'Atelier Corbusier. What we are actually interested in at CCA is a very an idea of a collection that is composed of very heterogeneous material. So this is a sketch that come from sketchbook from Alvaro Siza on his archive, sketches from Hajduk, photo of photography of Fritz Henley of this in Germany, where we actually document this kind of passage from a kind of industrial settings to a kind of changing the city and so on. So the collection is not only drawings and documents, but is also letters, promotional brochure, and is a way to expose attitude, motivation, assumption behind the work, and connect architecture to society in a context that is architecture is operating. So for us, it's not simply a question of material, it's a question of intention to relate architecture, as I say, to a much larger context. What we normally in this moment of like that the access to all our collection is actually not possible really physically. Also, we are asking ourselves what means to create a digital copy of the material that we have in the collection, and what this digital copy is. And so we have been already dealing with this question for many years, and we have, for example, decided that an object like this one, that is the amazing Fan Palace model by Cyril Price, we actually have filmed it in different forms to actually make it available for scholars to look at it. It's a very complex object to assemble, and actually every time we assemble, we risk to damage it. So, for example, so the idea is to create a kind of film of it so that you can look at it, but through a different form. Other institutions are considering, I don't know, 3D scan of models, but somehow for us that will be still better to then see the kind of real model. So I think our idea of creating this digital copy and digitizing the collection is very much the idea to give broader access to through different channels, and give broader access to our holding. Now, I think the digitization poses many challenges, and beside the technical ones, there are some that are more curatorially interesting to me. One is the scale of what we have. You can imagine that in an archive, we don't have 5,000 drawing, we might have 50,000 drawing just in one archive, and we now have, let's say, more than 200 archives. So the challenge of digitizing when we are confronted with that amount of material is massive. But also the question here is like that objects, they have a kind of inherent quality that is not always possible to capture in the moment that things are having a digital copy. So in 2011, we did actually a show that was curated by our curator public, Lev Bratishenko, that was called 404, The Objects is Not Online, and was actually focusing on what are the aspects that we lose visually or sensorially once the object is not anymore in front of us, or is a physical one. And so because objects, they have this kind of inherent quality. So for example, in this show, we showed a book that we have in our collection. It's a Murthy and Rao book, Rangavalli, that had actually smelled of Indian spices, and it was a kind of part of sensorial experience of it. Obviously, in the moment that this is digitized and online, this information is just in a caption, and you will not be able to experience that. Or this kind of toy by Bruno Taut and Blanche Malber that is actually done with glass blocks that they will not show their kind of fragility. So in the show was actually possible to play with that, and we had gloves because of it's so fragile that you actually are risking to break some glass pieces and hurt you. And then, or a drawing like the one that we had of Aldo Rossi, where you actually need 5 people to carry the drawing frame because it's so large. And then again, the moment that it's digitized, it loses its own scale. So these are some of the questions that and we didn't have really a solution. I don't think we have a solution for this loss of quality in the moment that is digitized, but it's just to say that this is one of our questions, and also might prioritize a certain idea of like why we'll digitize certain things and other. the other things is what I mentioned before, is what to select, and somehow what we have I've decided is actually to introduce a kind of idea of curating a selection. And so what we do is to with this program that is called Find and Tell, is we actually invite scholars in residency CCA and to actually look at an archive, and this was Sangeeta Bhaga on Pierre Jeanneret, and actually select a body of the archive to be digitized. So this has a multiple effect. First of all, we expose and we activate the collection to an expert and a scholar who become even more acquainted with the material. Is also producing a kind of selected focus. And so Sangeeta, for example, does a film and then also an essay. And so somehow the selection that she has done is actually supported by her own argument. I will say the important things, or the way I think is important to look at Pierre Jeanneret's work in Chandikar is this way. So it becomes also extremely important because then there is a dialogue with the scholars and the archivist and the collection team, so that we actually increase our knowledge about holdings. And so this is start to become a kind of stratification of digitization, where we, every time that there is such a residence, we put up another 2,000 images, for example, or of that archive. But as I said, is a kind of selected body. So this I think has been for us a way of having this kind of curated selection that creates around key periods, key areas that the scholars will decide that are fundamental. And until now, we have done it with, I would say, around 10 archives, and it is really a program that we will continue in the future. And so the other things we are trying to understand and we struggle with is that that to me has always been one of the contradiction, is that still to actually find something in our collection, you still have to do the search through words. So obviously the question of the data, or like how the images are described, is only possible if actually the person who described it put there that word. And so this is a big question for the future of like how rethink or how to enrich the data that we have, so that other stories or other kind of view can be introduced, and other way of discovering the material in the collection will be possible. So again, we are thinking of like how we, besides the team at CCA, we can involve scholar outside to actually implement this more richer description of our holdings. It's interesting with the digital board material that we also have at the CCA as a large collection. Obviously, in the metadata, we are now able to actually understand much more of the process of a drawing. So we are able to maybe understand who created the file, who worked on it, and so on. And so somehow is also interesting because the question of labor, for example, in architectural practice can be looked through the digital board material in a very different way, because we are able maybe to reconstruct the who were the entities and the people who actually worked on that drawing. And then I would say this question of the action. So it's a bit also what I said is like, I think there is a kind of I think as Patricio said, is it really in the name of the CCA, Canadian Center for Architecture? So this question of like, what are the things that the CCA as an institution can move forward in questioning, in bringing points, in activating through exhibition and collection some of the question. And I really like this Kurt Foster sentence that it says, it is the use being made of a collection that truly established their value. And I think Kurt wrote this when he was director of CCA. And so somehow I think what we have also been engaging in mixing really a kind of curatorial work with the collection work is really trying to mix this opportunity of looking at holding at CCA and inviting different voices to actually work on those archives. So what you have here are two books of one, the first one that we did on the archive of Avalos Herreros, the second one more recent on Martha Clark. And so the idea is that what we wanted was also to break a kind of monographic approach. When I say monography, means like the encounter of one author and one subject, and somehow say, okay, the archive is there, and from the beginning we should really push for more than one interpretation from the beginning. And so what we do is that we invite 3 architects or 3 practices or 3 scholars or 3 curators, and they simultaneously look into one archive and they come up with different readings or different parts of the archive that they think are relevant. So this has been a very productive way, I would say, of instigating the way we present again archives to CCA public through already the lens of some scholars or curators looking at it, but also already maybe having contradictory reading or completing reading of the archive. And with a recent acquisition that we have done with this recent donation of the Amancio Williams archive that arrived at CCA, the way we wanted to work from the beginning was to engage from the beginning with the let's say the scholars that are already working on the archive or on the figure, on the legacy of Amancio, and from the beginning understand what are their concerns, their preoccupation, and somehow imagine that can become really already influencing even our way of looking at the archive and processing it. So what we have done was last March, before that, actually, yes, was 8th of March last year. So basically 1 year ago, we were in Buenos Aires, and what we have asked to, as I say, scholars, journalists, or people were actually connected to Amancio, and especially also the family, to write a letter to Amancio and somehow address some of their concern. So I will just, this was Inés Moisset. And,
Querido Amancio, cuánto me alegra que la obra de ustedes pueda ser reconocida y custodiada. Tu contribución ya ha sido ampliamente difundida y seguramente podrá ser siempre revisada. Queda por saldar una deuda con tu socia, Delfina, una de las primeras arquitectas argentinas. Y además, una precursora de la modernidad. Porque vos, Amancio, no eras moderno antes de trabajar con ella. ¿Te acordás que tu primera obra fue un chalet pintoresquista en Mar del Plata? Es en las obras conjuntas, como el proyecto de viviendas en el espacio, y en la casa que construyeron sobre el arroyo para tus padres, donde aparecen con fuerza las ideas de vanguardia. En estas obras trabajaron juntos, como testimonian las publicaciones de la época. Fuiste uno de los primeros en reconocer el trabajo de una mujer como socia. Como le contaste en una carta a Le Corbusier, Delfina debió alejarse del trabajo para dedicarse al cuidado y a la formación de las 3 primeras hijas de ambos. Esto se llama división sexual de roles y no te impidió a vos continuar con tu profesión. También el archivo contiene material sobre una de tus colaboradoras, Colette Bocara, otra pionera, sobre la cual queda mucho aún por decir. El archivo es, por lo tanto, también una memoria de la producción de las arquitectas argentinas, que fueron ignoradas e invisibilizadas en las publicaciones posteriores. Tu archivo será uno de los pocos que rendirá memoria y dará voz a nuestras pioneras. Los tiempos han cambiado y miramos desde nuevas perspectivas. En 1943, le escribiste a Mario, tu hermano, un texto que aún emociona y que dice así: el espíritu de la época terminará por triunfar, y es mejor haber sido de los primeros, haber contribuido y no obstaculizado, haber comprendido y no haberse reído o indignado, haber acompañado y alentado a los precursores. Les precursores. Estoy segura de que entenderás. Te mando muchos cariños para vos y besos para la genia de Delfina.
So I think you can understand how these different letters, and was amazing the whole variety of letters that we have received were actually giving us a lot of elements of, like, first of all, already giving a lot of information that maybe it is in the archive, but somehow it's also helping to connect things, also relying on the fact that a lot of people who knew Amancio are still alive, and so they can actually contribute to gather this information. But it's interesting also that many of the points, for example, Ines is putting about, giving also credit and space to the wife of Amancio, Delfina, or these other collaborators, will certainly put the archivists in a kind of attention of like how we can recognize these different roles and somehow respond to the question that Ines poses. So I think it's been an interesting experiment for us. I don't think we have done it before, and I think was also related obviously to a kind of emotional moment of like the moment that the archive was leaving Buenos Aires, and then somehow creating also this kind of active connection with scholars that are currently working, and what will be them or other scholars will work in having this at the CCA. So,
querido Amancio,
sorry.
Cuánto me alegra que la...
So to conclude, I would say that beside all these activities, what is really motivating the CCA? So I think is the outcomes of all these CCA projects between exhibition, public program, paper publication, digital publication, but this overall kind of connection that we are able to make in between what we understand as kind of curatorial at large, and to actually use all this to build a kind of new discourse, a new agenda for contemporary architecture. And somehow at the entrance of our building, there is this sentence by Gordon Matta Clark that is actually part of, again, of our archive in one of his card of an architecture. And I find that it really explains a bit the quality of the institution. So the idea is that what we have to offer you is in the most elaborate form, confusion, guided by a clear sense of purpose. Thank you.
thank you, Giovanna, for a wonderful presentation and for the work that you are pursuing and that you presented. Just a reminder, please remember that the questions and answers tab is there, and I'll approach that immediately. There are many topics, or there are so many questions, so many issues that you sort of frame under topic, object, action, right? Almost as a call to engagement, a deep preoccupation with the state of architecture, the state of the archive, right? The problems of access that as researchers and as our students right now also doing research are sort of fundamental, not only to the production of knowledge, as you clearly make, but to the reinterpretation of knowledge and the activation of knowledge that you have argued also kind of reshape the architectural exhibition and moves it away from the traditional object, if you will, right, or a spatial object into a tool, right? And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this sort of proposition of understanding the role of the curator, the role of the exhibition as a tool of engagement, of production, but also as of criticality.
Yeah, I apologize if I try to put too many things in it, but I thought was maybe a way of yeah, showing a little bit the kind of approach and the kind of connection that it is real at CCA. It's like we tend to actually to work all these things at the same time. So I think I think certainly the idea that the exhibition is a kind of critical tool is very much part of like what we how we understand it. Like, so it's not an opportunity to show material or to even show a reading of the material, but somehow it goes beyond the material that is even shown. And so if I have to think about objects, we also have, for example, at the CCA, this category we call the invented object. It's like sometimes this has troubled registrar and collection deeply because they don't even know like who is the author of that object. Like we like in the moment that this is actually something that we create to sort of support an idea that we want to have in the show. I have to say that more and more I think it's not only the exhibition is a tool, is all these other new medium that are now ready to be used by a curator. So as I said, this kind of event that we did with this kind of performance where everyone read their letters and wrote their letters and inviting these people reading the letters, and was also a moment that maybe was intense and deep as it would be an exhibition, because it was actually performed at the same time. We are working with a lot of new media. We are more and more with film production at the CCA. So that's also another way of like, we are thinking of like why you will use documentary and or instead of using an exhibition, or instead of using another audio format and so on. So I think we are now in a moment where actually these tools start to multiply. And so what we are trying to do is to find the precision of like which is the right tool to actually convey that that idea or that point of view. And obviously is then also connected to the question of the public, is like who are then, if we do this in the format of documentary, who we're talking to and who is looking at is different from it is an exhibition. yeah, but I think I would say that where we are now is like more like a curator will come up with an idea of like we are now, for example, working for the future on the question of North, and so we actually start from, as I said, even the first things is the topic, and then we discuss which is actually the right format to talk about that, and is, if it is an exhibition, then how the exhibition is. But I would say we start from the idea of the topic, and then we understand which is the tool to be used for. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. We have questions from our students. Paola.
Hi, I was interested in the exhibition you mentioned beginning of the talk that was for 2021, the one on connecting architecture and society and this element of family. And I was wondering, when you said you were spatially rethinking about the urban landscape surrounding this element of family, for the exhibition itself, is there a specific country or time frame that's being looked at into, or is it more of a broader, like, global issue that's being addressed in the exhibition?
Thanks, Paula. It's a very crucial question. I think in terms of time frame, we're really looking at today, and so it's really in the last few years. In fact, we don't have anything in our collection to support this exhibition. So it's all this is very much worked out with studio visits, with architects, things that they are thinking of, they're on their desk. And we have been working with fantastic curator Melissa Aris for photography to also have a kind of parallel photo component in the exhibition to visualize some of these questions. So let's say if one of the topic is family, and we are really looking at, obviously everybody speaks about the sort of like disappearing of the traditional family, but then we are looking at, okay, what are these new other forms of family that are coming up, and especially what that means. So somehow it's true that we have a Western point of view, and we are looking mainly in, let's say, I would say North America, Europe. There are examples in Asia, for example, but in my visit to for example, to Buenos Aires, I was very much interested in this typologies that is there of this kind of monoambiente, like this idea that you just have one room. And so somehow it is a living for one person somehow. So this idea of the family in the future being one unity, maybe, or maybe being multiple units. Like in the show, we have a group that is a group of friends that are in Berlin, and it's like 9 people, and there are polyamorous groups. There are different families that are like 2 gay couples that have shared the kids together, and they all want to live together, but somehow there is not a kind of family house that actually can welcome this kind of new community somehow. So we are really looking at how, especially I would say in terms of housing, these new forms of cohabitation can be understood. We are looking at multi-generation, obviously has another thing. There are architects that are proposing to take down the wall that divide you from your neighborhood and actually define that as a space. So that space will be up to you and your neighborhood, how you want to use it. If it's a common space, it's actually, you use it on alternate day, but somehow enhance the fact that you will actually need to talk to your neighborhood and make an agreement, hopefully not a disagreement, but so we are interested, and I think the overall thing is like, we are not, we're not entering it like, is this a society we want, we don't want, like we are not entering, we don't have a judgmental, but we are actually looking at, like, it seems there is an ask imagine spaces that are actually allowing for more flexibility, more openness, and so on. And so why we're still designing apartments with, you know, 1 living room and 2 bedrooms somehow. So these are the questions we are posing.
Maria Fernanda, please, please ask your question. Can you turn on your camera?
Hello.
Hi, Maria Fernanda.
Hello, hi. I didn't know that I have to speak in English, so I will do my best. Well,
I'm also doing Spanish, but then I don't know the public.
no, it's okay. I will try my best. But my question was about these activities, find and tell, and well, like this. How does this affect the acquisition to the collection? Maybe it has new lines of research and expositions and so on. That was my question.
It's a very good question, because I think the you know, many scholars come to the CCA and look at the collection, but they do it in the study room. And obviously there are some exchanges with our staff, but maybe sometimes there is not so much dialogue. So the idea that this is actually happening in the archive and all our team is there all the time with this invited curator, it actually allows for a lot of exchange of knowledge, and also of like expanding, like a person will be there, it's like, oh, but if you have this, will be interesting for you to look also at this, and so on. And so it has been becoming for me a very interesting moment where they are able to actively give us feedback of things that might be, I don't know, I don't say mistake in the cataloging, but somehow maybe missing information or way of expanding in the collection and through further acquisition and so on. So I think it is it's been a wonderful encounter that is happening. It came to me as an idea. I was very privileged to be we did many years ago an exhibition on James Sterling, and I was all the time in the archive with Tony Vidler when he was actually making a selection, and to make it looked, I don't know, 4,000, 5,000 drawings, and I was there all the time, and it was very interesting for me. And I was like, we are not capturing this knowledge. Like, he will do a show and he will do a book, but somehow there was a lot of things said or like that he kind of shared there, and so I thought that was like a very privileged moment for me, and then somehow it's like how we, even is in a formal like oral history, how we can actually capture that moment of research that is a moment of shared research somehow. So that's what we, and certainly has an impact. We are doing a project now, it's called Centering Africa, with many scholars coming from the continent, and has been also extremely important for us to understand how we will be able to expand our knowledge and our collection on those areas, and really knowing also figures that might not be, that we might not know, or we might not know where the resources are, and so on. So this tighter connection between scholars and curators, I think, is extremely productive.
Thank you. Eric.
Sure, thank you. We know that in this moment, coronavirus pandemic have a great importance in our in your society. So technology have more importance in our lives. I would like to ask about, in your opinion, architecture expositions will transcend architecture spaces to create a virtual experience who reflects our changing society? And if you think that, what will be the first step to do that new virtual experiences?
Thanks a lot, Eric. I think the first things we need to consider, and I think was very clear this year, is that we take from the granted this digital access is possible for everyone, but we know very well that it's also one of these other situation where actually not everybody has access to Wi-Fi, not everybody has access to knowledge through digital. So, and I think it's a geographical thing, but I think it's not only that. So I think we need to be careful to imagine that everything will move to that, because I think we still need to understand that this means also might actually be a barrier for many people. I think the way I see many institutions have went to a kind of virtual exhibition of virtual spaces, and I think to me the question is still like I don't know how relevant it is to kind of create a digital space that is a copy of a physical one. And I think the question we have been asking ourselves is like how we transfer the content that is actually now existing in a physical show in a digital form. That doesn't mean that has to reproduce the physicality of the show somehow. So the question is like how you communicate those ideas. It's like will be not different from like you think, okay, you have an exhibition and you have a book. It's a really different medium. So how you will then transform that for a kind of different medium. So I think to me that will be more interesting and productive, is like how I transform that and how I use the digital as a different way of also as a different medium where I actually can have what we have now, that we have a conversation, that we have actually an engagement that maybe the physical doesn't allow. So yeah, I think, and I have to say the challenge, I think that if I see this from an institutional point of view, is that somehow the tools we have now are all so similar that somehow the experience of the institution has been flattened. So before, I don't know, going to the Met, going to the MoMA, going to I don't know, the Jumex in Mexico City will be a kind of physical experience where you actually have, but now because this is becoming this space, so the design of the space is actually less important, and what defines the institution is actually even more the content or the approach. Like in this series, your decision to frame it in a certain way or to give it a certain character and so on would what differentiate from another institution is doing another series on curating architecture. And I think this is also nice. It means that content and character will become more important than the space where we are. I don't know if this convinced you as an answer.
So it's a great answer. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Mickey.
Hello, thank you for speaking with us today. So I thought it interesting when you spoke in your essay for architecture and also a bit today about the reconstructing and rebuilding of objects within exhibitions and doing so in order to uphold the curatorial narrative. And so I'm curious as to what the process is like, particularly in terms of ensuring that historical representation is upheld as accurately and closely as possible.
Is a very good question. So in a show that I did some years ago was called Journeys, how traveling foods and so on. It was a show about how ideas migrate from one place to another and inform somehow the place and the culture of architecture, or the culture of crafting, or the culture of building in the new place that they are landing. And we wanted to show a project that of a Canadian architect, but UK based, Wells Coates, that we have in our collection. And this project was about a big project that actually the electricity company of Quebec, Hydro-Quebec, has commissioned him, because basically to build a certain series of dam and things like this to actually facilitate this kind of energy production, a lot of villages will go underwater. A little bit what is happening more recently now with China. So a lot of villages will go underwater, and so they asked Wells Coates to think about these new settlements will be few kilometers, not even like 1 kilometer's distance from the old village that will be under the water. And all his question was like, what we need to maintain of the old, the project is fascinating because he decided not really to maintain, well, maybe to reconstruct or to save certain building, but somehow to maintain the scale and the proximity that there was in the old village. So to actually maintain the let's say the block dimension and things like this. So the kind of community, even if it's physically displaced, was still having a kind of sense of belonging somehow. So the but in a letter that we had in archive, he was actually explaining this project, and one was, I thought, was very nice letter when he explained this, and he imagined that, you know, the large boat coming from Europe will enter in the river, and they will encounter this new village, and this new village is Iroquois. That is actually the name of the First Nation community, and that they will be the kind of welcoming moment, and that they will be, you will discover this new community there. And what he imagined, there will be a tall building with a large neon on top. And so to me, this was very fascinating, all the description. Also imagine that he will actually really wants to put the, you know, the First Nation name of the village will be a kind of things that in the fog, imagine it a kind of cold winter, and there will be this. So I thought we need to rebuild this neon. I thought it was fascinating description, but we didn't really have a design for the neon. So what we did was that we actually look at the drawings, and as typical architectural drawings, you know, you will have the architect writing the name of the project, and it was done with a very specific typography. And so what we did was like, okay, we take this typography and we imagine that that's the neon will be done with this kind of, and so obviously it was not at the scale that he imagined it, that was on top of a building. So it was still a gallery reconstruction, but somehow it was a way of bringing you in his idea of like, what will be the role of this new community in welcoming people to Canada and welcoming people with this First Nation name and so on. And so to me, the neon was a prompt or a kind of entry in the story that then you will look at the drawings and so on, but the drawings will not be maybe so easy to read and also get excited about all that story. So this is why sometimes we invent these objects, because of the idea of like how you get to be intrigued by the architectural drawing or that archival material. And so it's true. We explained that was done based on the information, but was our own reinterpretation. So it was not a perfect copy because actually it was never built. So maybe we're not 100% accurate either.
Thank you. Oops. Yes. No. I'm being told by Marcela that who's the timekeeper, that our time is up. Marcela, you are muted. there are more questions. There are more questions, but I mean, I invite you to continue this conversation with our other panelists. And of course, I want to thank Giovanna deeply for this incredible opportunity in this conversation. And let's definitely continue these conversations and building alliances, which is clearly what you're actually doing. Also, so thank you so much for sharing your time. I know you're very busy, and there's much to do. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Giovanna. It was amazing. And I hope to see you all on March 17th for the second event on the series with Ricardo Daza. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yes.
Patricio and